At its core, commercial law defines a transaction through a highly specific mechanism, the transfer of ownership of movable property in exchange for a price. This mechanism only functions when 7 essential legal elements are present. According to the Sale of Goods Act, a valid sale requires 2 distinct parties, goods that are strictly movable, a legal transfer of property, executed delivery, a price paid in money, a defined contract type, whether absolute or conditional, and the satisfaction of standard valid contract rules. But a baseline contract is rarely the complete story. Most commercial transactions are governed by stipulations, specific binding rules and terms layered on top of those 7 structural elements. The central tension in commercial law arises when the physical reality of a delivered product fails to meet these stipulations. You pay for a new, working piece of equipment, and you receive something obsolete or defective. The legal system cannot rely on subjective fairness to resolve this. It requires a precise, calculable mechanism to determine the exact extent of a seller's liability when a contractual promise is broken. To evaluate that liability, we have to map the legal architecture that systematically separates deal-breaking failures from minor, compensable defects. Understanding this framework is critical. It provides the legal authority to determine if a breach of terms permits a buyer to void a transaction or restricts them to seeking financial compensation. The law forces all contractual stipulations into one of 2 distinct categories, determined entirely by their severity and importance to the deal. This master algorithmic flowchart starts with a single contract stipulation that splits into 2 distinct branches, a condition on the left and a warranty on the right. On the left, a condition is defined as a stipulation that is absolutely essential to the main purpose of the contract. The statutory remedy for a breached condition is absolute. It grants the buyer complete repudiation, meaning they have the right to cancel the contract entirely, reject the defective goods, and demand a full refund. On the right, a warranty is a stipulation that is merely collateral or supporting to the contract's primary objective. Because a warranty is secondary, its breach does not destroy the agreement. The contract survives, but the buyer is entitled to claim financial damages to offset the specific defect. The interaction between these 2 classifications is governed by a strict legal mechanism known as the conversion axiom. The law allows for downward conversion. A buyer can legally elect to downgrade a breached condition into a warranty. This occurs when they choose to keep the defective goods and sue for financial damages instead of executing a full cancellation. However, this mechanism is strictly unidirectional. A breached warranty can never be legally upgraded to a condition to force a cancellation. Classifying a product defect into one of these 2 nodes is the only legally recognized way to determine whether a sales contract lives or dies. Even if a written contract is sparse, the law intervenes to protect buyers from information asymmetry through implied stipulations. These are mandatory terms automatically embedded and enforced by statute, regardless of what the parties actually wrote down. Focusing entirely on the left side of our framework, we can see the condition branch drop down into 7 interconnected subnodes. These represent the specific implied conditions strictly enforced by law. The first is the condition as to title. The seller must possess the actual legal right to sell the item. If a seller transfers stolen goods, the buyer does not receive legal ownership. The law permits the buyer to immediately reject those goods and reclaim their funds. The second, third, and fourth conditions require the goods to strictly match any given description, any provided sample, or the exact combination of both description and sample.
If a buyer is promised a brand new machine but receives an obsolete or heavily used model, the delivered good fails the description test. This grants the buyer the right to repudiate the contract. The 5th node is the condition as to quality or fitness. Normally, the rule is buyer beware, but a specific exception applies here. If a buyer explicitly specifies a purpose for the goods and relies on the seller's professional skill, the product must be legally fit for that exact purpose. Providing a pair of standard walking shoes when the buyer explicitly requested specific running shoes breaches this condition, making the seller liable. The 6th node dictates merchantability. Goods must be functionally usable for their standard intent. A purchased pen that fails to write or a watch with dead internal mechanics breaches the condition of merchantability. The final node is the condition of wholesomeness. This applies exclusively to consumable items. It enforces strict liability to ensure food is safe for human consumption. If a buyer is sold spoiled food, they have the immediate right to repudiate. These 7 implied conditions act as a powerful statutory override to buyer beware. They establish an uncompromisable legal baseline for fundamental product utility and commercial safety. Shifting our analytical focus away from deal-breaking conditions, we move to the secondary branch of the liability model. Looking at the right side of this flowchart, we reveal 4 specific subnotes representing implied warranties. The first implied warranty is quiet possession. Once a transaction clears, the buyer is entitled to the undisturbed use of the goods. If a third party emerges to claim ownership rights post-sale, the seller is financially liable for the resulting disruption. The second node is the warranty that goods are free from encumbrances. The transferred asset must arrive clean. There can be no hidden loans, liens, or financial charges attached to it by a third party. Third is the warranty, requiring a dangerous goods warning. If a seller distributes hazardous materials, like a corrosive chemical, without clearly labeling the inherent dangers, they become legally liable for any resulting physical or financial damages. Finally, the fourth node represents fitness by trade usage. In many industries, standard expectations are built purely on historical norms. The law enforces these established trade practices as warranties, even if they were never spoken aloud during negotiations. These 4 implied warranties act as an essential buffer. They protect buyers against hidden costs, without unnecessarily destroying the underlying commercial agreement. Looking at this master flowchart, we can see the liability model for conditions and warranties functioning as a rigid, step-by-step logical algorithm. We are tracing a simulation path for a scenario where a buyer purchases a new mobile phone. The sequence begins at the point of sale. The buyer receives the new phone, but shortly after, a technical defect is discovered. The first analytical requirement in our algorithm is identification. We must determine if the specific defect breaches an express stipulation clearly written in the contract or an implied rule embedded by statute. Once identified, the law assesses the structural weight of the breach. The algorithm routes the defect down the correct pathway, determining if the failure disrupts the core of the deal as a fundamental condition of merchantability or if it is merely a peripheral breach of a warranty. The logical sequence concludes by executing the corresponding statutory remedy at the bottom of the flowchart. Depending on the pathway taken, the buyer is awarded either total repudiation and a refund or mathematically calculated damages. By establishing these rigid classifications for conditions and warranties, the law systematically enforces commercial integrity. It guarantees that the physical reality of transferred goods strictly mirrors the contractual promises made.